Training trends have come and gone in performance cycling, but which one actually works? Polarized, reverse periodization, pyramidal, zone 2, anyone? You'd be forgiven for being slightly confused, but in this video, I'm going to explain each main training theory, as well as speak to a number of coaches to get their take on what does or doesn't work, and which one can make the most difference to your riding. When I say training trend, what I mean is a way of organising and structuring your riding. So instead of trying to improve your fitness by riding longer and harder, you're instead sticking to a kind of set principle and philosophy to guide your training. Now, there is a lot of different methods out there and a lot of different ways of thinking when it comes to this. But for the purpose of this video, I'm going to stick to the 10 most commonly used training theories. Polarized, pyramidal, reverse periodization, zone 2, fatigue resistance, the Norwegian method, FTP, carbohydrate periodization, environmental stresses such as altitude or heat training, and off-bike strength work. Some of those, I admit, can be used together, but I do believe each on its own can have its own core following. So, for example, plenty of people supplement their riding with strength and conditioning. In fact, most, myself included, would say this is generally a good idea. But the reason that is included on the list is that some would push for strength work to take a much greater precedence and make it one of the real core foundations of a training method. Before, though, we evaluate all of these methods, here is a quick explainer as to what each one actually means. Polarized training emphasises mostly easy riding with a small amount of very hard efforts, while pyramidal training builds a pyramid of volume with most training time spent easy, some moderate, and a little bit of high intensity sessions. Reverse periodization flips polarized and pyramidal by starting off a training plan with high intensity work and adding that low intensity, longer endurance riding further down the line in the future. Zone 2 training involves placing a large focus on riding at an exercise intensity where you're burning the maximum amount of fat that you can, without switching into a higher intensity riding where your body would be principally burning glycogen as a fuel source. It's the riding intensity at which your type 1 muscle fibers are working at capacity, and the point of this method is to stress these type 1 slow twitch muscle fibers as much as possible without having to recruit those type 2 glycogen burning fast twitch fibers and having to switch into a different metabolic system. The benefits of zone 2 include getting really good training adaptations without the fatigue cost. Fatigue resistance focuses on building the ability to push hard even after long hours in the saddle and is often termed repeatability. Proponents of it often quote how it's more valuable for a rider to be able to do X amount of watts after a certain amount of work than a headline standout number when fresh. The Norwegian method, on the other hand, is a really data-driven, high-volume training approach for endurance athletes made famous by the likes of Christian Blumenfeld. It focuses on intense, high-frequency training, guided by really consistent lactate monitoring throughout training, so you can really precisely control the intensity you're doing your efforts at. And you're also talking really high weekly training volumes of up to 40 hours per week, double threshold days, and placing a high value on data analytics all the time to really tweak your training. FTP, or functional threshold power, revolves around understanding a rider's FTP and basing all training around a kind of zonal system which is extrapolated from this number. Carbohydrate periodization places a key focus on manipulating your fueling to gain specific adaptations. And environmental stresses, I'm talking about placing a huge value on things like altitude blocks up a mountain, or heat training with the likes of a core body sensor to win some pretty unique endurance benefits that you arguably couldn't be achieving elsewhere. Finally, that off-the-bike strength work, so focusing on power, resilience, and injury resistance, making that an essential complement or focus in and of itself to time spent on the bike. A lot of different theories out there then, and some of which are actually directly opposing one another. But what actually works for your riding and which training template is worth sticking to? I reached out to a number of different cycling coaches who've worked with both amateur and professional riders alike to get their take. Ollie Beckinsale is a 3-time Olympian and now coach with experience helping a range of different riders try to get the most out of themselves performance-wise. Is there a trend, if any, that he'd follow? Ollie, you've been racing and also coaching riders for a lot longer
Too long.
me. And you've seen kind of trends come and go.
Yes.
What would you say is the trend to follow, if any?
I think the biggest one, if you had to have a trend of how people are going to perform and the underlying philosophy of training, consistency. Yeah, I think from an athlete, an ex-athlete, I raced 16 years, so a long time. And then as a coach with other athletes from keen amateurs through to professionals, the most important thing is being consistent. And I think if I was going to have that as exaggerate one thing in training, it was consistency. I think if I was going to have a second one, it would be specificity. So looking at your demands of your event, your strengths and weaknesses, and then looking at how you're going to increase. So marking yourself out of 10. So thinking, well, what's on your, call it like the shopping list of things that you need. So a guy doing the Étape de Tour will have a different shopping list than a guy who's trying to win a cross-country mountain bike race. And then it's marking yourself out of 10 and then going, well, actually, which things am I going to focus on to get the best responses? And then if you're looking at training styles, one of those will probably be the best thing to achieve what you're trying to do, to achieve, to tick that box on the shopping list.
In terms, though, of organising your training, do you think it does help to have some sort of kind of philosophy or way of thinking to get the most out of yourself and do certain bits at certain times? And does that help the kind of belief that what you're doing is correct?
I think if I was looking at myself and I was training, and if I was looking at any athletes now, you always have a phase plan. That's the first thing I would have. It doesn't have to be too fancy, but it's a general overview. I have a Google sheet, and we were training tomorrow. Here's your Google sheet. You put your events in, you put your times on holiday, and then I would have some over. Now, that's when your training philosophy comes in. So I know that these are the things I would like to build first, and you might have a mix of things in that phase, but there is a headline, what we're trying to achieve in that phase. And it could be to increase your aerobic fitness, it could be your anaerobic fitness, it could be of a certain power. We're looking at 5 second, 1 minute, 5 minute. But you want to have a 2 or 3 things that you're trying to work on during that phase, whether it's 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks or something. I think that's really important to have a guide as to what you're trying to achieve. It's very easy to kind of have this shotgun approach as an athlete that's grabbing, especially if they don't have anyone coaching them. It's very easy we all absorb a lot of information, and it's very difficult to kind of filter that, and it can have this shotgun approach where we're trying to do every different training philosophy. So I don't think it necessarily needs to be one specific one, but I think you need to have something that's underpinning your training. The biggest one for me is I see it almost, if I had a philosophy that works for most riders, I see the body as having an engine, which is up to your, and let's call it your anaerobic threshold. We describe it in a number of areas, FTP. Up to there is your engine, above there is your turbo. You do long distance things using your engine. And then above that, your turbo is your anaerobic work, your sprints, your Strava climbs, your race winning moves. Some riders have a very developed engine. Some riders have a very developed turbo. And then depending on their strengths and weaknesses in the event, which one are we going to push? But I see it as an engine and a turbo. So that's my kind of philosophy, really.
Sports scientist Peter Leo is a high-performance coach currently with Jayco Alula. I got in touch with him to get his take on this and see if there are any specific trends that emerge for just pro riders whom he is mostly associated with. As a coach to many of the sport's top riders, what do you think is a kind of overriding trend in terms of training which is most prevalent in the pro peloton?
It's hard to summarize it in one sentence, but I would still say even for a road pro, volume is king and intensity matters. I think that's the compromise. Volume is king, but intensity matters. I think that's fair to conclude. I think in the history, or in the recent history, we are confronted with a lot of buzzwords and hot topics, which I think we dive a bit more into it now.
Do you think mentally it helps a rider a lot to know why they're doing a certain training session, and the fact that it's got this name around it and it's got research and thinking behind it in terms of making them stronger?
Yeah, I think nowadays the way riders want to be trained is quite sophisticated, and I think you would be, or I think you can confirm yourself, the riders you deal now in the World Tour are pretty well educated when it comes down to knowledge. Like speaking to now sports directors, when they have been riders 20 years ago, they almost didn't know anything about training and training methodology. But because information is so accessible now through podcasts, through articles, through videos, whatever, through TCN, it's really easy for actually riders to understand more about why you do things. So yes, you definitely need to nowadays add more context, especially to younger riders. Older riders are still fine with being a bit more guided, but you very often have, before you actually want to employ a session to a training structure, with a young rider, you almost need to have a conversation about why you want to do things. And I think it's a good thing. I'm not saying that this is a bad thing, but yeah, I think the young generation of rider, what we even see in the pro peloton, is quite well educated.
If you were at a push, how would you rank the training trends that I've identified for the pro peloton?
Yeah, sure. I would go with fatigue resistance first, followed by high carbs, zone 2, FTP, pyramidal, polarized, strength, altitude / heat, Norwegian, and reverse periodization.
Ollie, I've given you a bit of time to think. We're going to get you to kind of rank the key trends in pro cycling and cycling in general from 1 to 10. So you go in there. What do you think is number one?
I think like this is based on low-end race guy, high sportive sort of level. So keen amateur. I think, it's different for professionals. But I think if I was going to rank these, I still think threshold FTP. Number one, if you've got a good FTP for most cycling disciplines, you'll do all right. You'll get by. That for me is increase the size of your engine. 2, fatigue resistance. You can have a mega FTP on a turbo trainer, but after 3 or 4 hours, you still got to be able to get the power out. So I think that's essential for a lot of guys. Polarized training, I think a lot of guys focus there in the middle. I think we need some base miles. I think we need to hit some efforts, some intervals. So I think that's important. So 4, zone 2. I mean, it's something I'm short of. I've got limited time, young family. So I'm short base miles. So some zone 2 and the benefits that brings physiologically, I don't think you can shortcut it. Strength and gym at number 5, really important. It's not, if you've got no spare time, it's probably the one that gets dumped, but I think having some in there is really important, mainly not to necessarily be stronger, but core strength and injury. So I think that's important. Norwegian method, I put 6th. Not really for your kind of keen amateurs. You need a lactate monitor and you need a pretty on-the-ball coach to do it. But it's something I'm really interested in. I think it's the way to train. So I think I put it 6. Carbohydrate, 7. All at the moment, it's about high carb intake. I still think there's some benefits of doing some sessions with low carb, not to the extremes we were talking about where we used to ride for hours on nothing, on air. But I think running a bit light and some fat efficiency still is useful. So 7, altitude and heat. Big thing with the heat training, altitude, it's a way of gaining some marginal gains. I think it's really important, but it comes at a cost mentally and physically, I think. So number 8, reverse periodization. I still think that where things are positioned isn't the be all and end all. I think it's the consistency in getting it done. For example, in the UK, if you're training, what's more important is working out what works best with the weather rather than an actual philosophy. And pyramidal, number 10. I don't think it's a concern if the intervals, there's no big magic session or structure. I think it's got to be a bit more specific. And I think the big thing for most guys, it's working around their life, so the time they've got available, And we just talked about the weather as well. Big difference. So number 10.
It's been really interesting for myself to dive into the topic of training trends a little deeper and hear from both Ollie and Peter on how there really isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to every rider. It does depend on the goal and the rider themselves. When we are debating training though, it's worth acknowledging that there is almost an infinite amount of power data at our disposal now to analyse. So aside from opinion, surely there is evidence out there that can categorically prove what does or doesn't work, and that can be seen in the data. To find out, I reached out to Armando Mastracci, co-founder of training platform Xert, which uses mathematical models to analyse and prescribe training. Armando said how when they first set up Xert and its models, they deliberately took an agnostic approach. So the platform was totally data-driven with no human emotion input or philosophy that one training trend was better than another. So what has it discovered from all this data from their users? The answer again is it depends. Each person is different with different physiology and crucially different goals. For some, a polarized training approach might work better, but for others who are training very hard right at the edge of what's possible, the training Xert will suggest is actually closer to what the Norwegian method may look like. But what I found really interesting is how the training is automatically periodized. It has recognized in people's data that different energy systems take different amounts of time to train. High intensity performance is improved quicker, but low intensity endurance takes a lot longer to build. Naturally, because it has detected this in the data, the training is organized accordingly. You need to start building that endurance earlier and start planning it in earlier in your plan. High intensity takes less time, so it can be built up nearer the end towards a key goal. And it backs up what both Ollie and Peter said really. Hours and volume of training spent on your bike is what's really key in order to improve. As Peter said to me, unfortunately, there aren't any shortcuts. Sorry folks. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Have you followed a training trend before? And if so, how did you find it? Thanks for watching all, and we'll see you on the next one.